Hello, CS161. Welcome back to the Discussion 3 walkthrough. This is the same TA for the past 2 weeks, still John. It's been a couple weeks in the class, so hopefully you are settling in, wishing you, good studies and good health during these times. Great. So last week, you might recall, we talked a bit about software security and some vulnerabilities like buffer overflows, along with the exploits that can come from it, whether it's like return-oriented programming or code injection, all sorts of crazy stuff. So hopefully you found that interesting and you can see all the malicious things you're capable of doing with C. But as a reminder, make sure that if you do want to put this in practice, that you ask for the right permissions and make sure that you're on the good guy's side. Great. So during this, for this discussion, we're going to open up the module on cryptography, which takes up a good chunk of this class. There's going to be a lot of discussion of cryptographic functions in the coming weeks and their applications. But for this week, we're just going to look at the foundational algorithms and functions that constitute basic encryption. And it's what makes a lot of what we're going to talk about in the weeks coming possible. So before this discussion, I'd recommend just going through the lectures and the notes on one-time pads, on symmetric key encryption, on block ciphers, and then on this idea of indistinguishability, and you would be well equipped to answer and follow along with these questions. Great, so diving into it, question number 1, block ciphers and entropy potpourri. Explain how an adversary can always win the IND-CPA game against a deterministic encryption algorithm. Given identical plaintext, a deterministic encryption algorithm will produce identical ciphertext. So there's a couple of terms being used here. IND-CPA game is one of them. A deterministic encryption algorithm is important to pay attention to. And we're given these parameters of like identical plaintext, deterministic encryption algorithm. And we know from here, because it's by definition deterministic, it produces an identical ciphertext. So if you don't recall what IND-CPA is, I recommend looking at the notes, but just as like a quick recollection, IND-CPA refers to one of many standards for checking whether a particular key encryption algorithm preserves indistinguishability. So what we're referring to with indistinguishability is that the ciphertext generated by an algorithm for any given input should not result in something deterministic, or should not result in something where in the future, given the same input, you could just match the output ciphertext to ciphertext coming from before. So just to draw it out really quickly, the IND-CPA game. So IND, again, is indistinguishability. There's different standards like CPA, CCA1, CCA2. CPA refers to indistinguishability under what's called chosen plaintext attack. So in this game, and when we talk about these games for these indistinguishability standards, what we're referring to is just kind of like this thought experiment, sort of, to check whether an adversary can effectively break this encryption algorithm by being able to tell ciphertext apart. So what happens in this game is the adversary gives the what we call the challenger, so that's C on the left right here. So the adversary gives C M0 and M1. So these are two arbitrary plain text files. Doesn't really matter what's in them as long as they are different. So it submits the plain text, and then the challenger is going to pick one of these files to randomly encrypt and then return the encrypted text to the adversary. So we're going to call it CX, X arbitrarily being like the ciphertext 0 or 1 corresponding to M0 and M1. So the adversary is free to use any of the resources in the realms of as much computation as it likes, as much attempts at encryption or decryption as it needs, and it can also hold on to the history of previous games, right? So if it played a game, it submitted certain plain text in, it can hold on to the ciphertext that it was given back, and it can hold on to the answer or the confirmation that C gives as to whether the adversary correctly identified the plain text corresponding to the ciphertext in this game. Right? So the adversary is going to submit a guess, and this guess is going to correspond to, does it think CX corresponds to M0, or was it generated from the encryption of M1? And then the challenger is going to confirm the answer. So it's going to say, yes, you're correct. It was a ciphertext generated from M0, or yes, it was M1, or vice versa. Great. So the problem here, as you can see, is the fact that it is deterministic, which is really a no-go when it comes to indistinguishability. Because the idea is, let's just say in the first game, the adversary passes in M0 and M1. And let's just say that, the ciphertext that C gave back turned out to be C0. So A knows, okay, I submitted some plain text. Doesn't really matter what my guess was. It's just like a 50-50 toss-up. But the challenger is telling me that the encryption algorithm gave me back C0, corresponding to my M0 text, right? So now all I have to do is, for the second game, I still submit M0, and then I can submit like M1. The M1 value doesn't really matter. But the idea is that if the encryption algorithm is deterministic, if C decides to encrypt M0 again, it would deterministically give back C0. If it wasn't C0, if the challenger decides to encrypt M1, then it would just give back C1, which would be different from C0. But pretty much for the second game, all the adversary has to do is identify whether or not the new ciphertext from game 2 matches the one from game 1. If it does, then the adversary would correctly guess that the encryption was from M0, and if it doesn't match, then the adversary can just correctly guess that it was an encryption of M1. So again, and just go over again, in one sentence, the idea is that the adversary can just pass in M0 again, or whatever file was encrypted in the first place, and then compare it with the new encryption given in the second game. If they match, then the same plain text was encrypted. If not, then it was the other plain text. So game 1 is a toss-up for the adversary, but game 2 and onwards, because the adversary is allowed to control the plain text that it actually provides in this game, and because the algorithm is deterministic, the adversary can win with a 100% rate going forward. So proving that deterministic encryption algorithms are not going to hold up when it comes to this IND CPA game. Great. So number 2, why does a block cipher need to be a permutation? So the key term here is block cipher. So just in case you don't remember, block ciphers build upon symmetric key encryption. So the idea is that, if with symmetric key encryption, I can encrypt like a single value and then decrypt. So I encrypt and decrypt with the same key. Right? So with block ciphers, we use this to encrypt messages of arbitrary length. So if we have like a message, let's just say our message is like, I don't know, computer dash security. And that's our input. And our input can be of arbitrary length, again, which is why block ciphers are important. So I guess this is sort of worth pointing out. Just remember that for symmetric key encryption, in order for things to work, the key that's given, or if it's sort of like an XOR function, the key that's given has to be at least the length of the value itself, right? So by chopping up the message into blocks, so for like computer security, we can segment it into like chunks of 4 characters, Q, T, and then, if there's anything remaining, we just add some padding. So we can chop this message into fixed size blocks and then use fixed length symmetric key encryption, for example, like the AES algorithm that we talked about in class, to encrypt each block, right? And then we add padding if necessary. So we have a lot of schemas for block ciphers. So with block ciphers, we have like the electronic codebook schema. We have like cipher, block chaining, output feedback. So these are all different implementations of block ciphers. But just remember, for all of these block ciphers, like when we look at these schemas, these block ciphers need to be one-to-one so that they are invertible. I'll draw the diagram as an example for CBC down here, right? So let's just say we chop up our plain text into P0, P1, and P2 maybe. So we're passing in this plain text, and we have like an initialization vector that's not really a key, but just is since we don't have a ciphertext to XOR the first plain text segment with, we use an initialization vector. We pass the XORed result into a block cipher. Oh, sorry, I guess I wrote that in reverse order. We pass in the key for the block cipher, and it spits out some ciphertext 0, right? Now, when we encode P1 or encrypt P1, we're not going to use another initialization vector. Instead, we're going to use C0, and we're going to, again, pass this into the cipher block, and then that's going to give us ciphertext 1, right? And we'll do the same thing with P2. Now, you can potentially and hopefully see from here that the block cipher must be one-to-one, because if it wasn't a permutation, then more than one input could result in the same output, right? So even though P0 and P1, like let's just say that they're different, if after this, IV, there's like, XOR and then cipher block, and then C0 is equal to C1, which is, pretty much there's just like a collision here. Then the issue is, for block ciphers, we have, so this is like the encryption form of CBC, right? But for CBC, we also have a decryption algorithm. So the reason we need it to be one-to-one is so that the decryption works. So I won't go over that. I recommend looking at the textbook or the notes if you don't quite remember what that looks like. But it's pretty much just the ciphertext goes back into the block cipher with the key, and then that output is going to be XORed with the initialization vector. So again, remember the XOR property, if A XOR B gives you just B, right? So the idea here is the ciphertext XORed with IV from before should just give you back the original plain text. Now the issue is if C0 and C1 are the same, but they're actually pointing at different plain texts that are actually fundamentally different values, then that collision prevents us from being able to distinguish what the actual input is. So this is why a block cipher needs to be a permutation. So I'll just write here because it needs to be invertible and one-to-one, and this is to make the decryption part of block ciphers work. Cool. Great. So for part C, what are good possible sources of entropy for key generation for a block cipher? So hopefully you talked a little bit about this. Assume a hardware noise generator is a good source of entropy on its own. These usually incorporate physical sources for randomness. We won't really get into specifically how this thing works, at least in this discussion, but you can just trust that this is in fact a good source of entropy. So when tackling these problems, it's sort of, I'd recommend a two-fold approach. So for one, you want to just figure out, like, is this a good source of entropy? Is this a good source of entropy? And oftentimes, when we have different sources of entropy, we can combine them together, right, to generate more randomness. Now, the rule of thumb here is if I combine a weak source of entropy and another weak source of entropy, then I'm going to still get a weak source of entropy. Putting together a bunch of weak sources of entropy doesn't make the resulting output stronger, it's still weak. On the other hand, if I passed in like a strong source of entropy with any form of other entropy, like it could be weak, it could be strong, this source of entropy is going to be strong. So again, like if you're combining entropy, there's not really, well, there are cases where entropy is removed, but in general, and it'll be removed more because of the operation. So I guess the third point is to see like how is your entropy combined. So as you can kind of see on the bottom here, hopefully that's a hint. If you're combining XOR, combining sources of entropy with potentially XOR right here, or the AND function, that's actually going to affect the resultant entropy. So just a set of guidelines to sort of think about this. But we will go through this. So I'll put down the answer, and then when the solutions come out, those have sort of a much more detailed explanations, but I will just explain them in a couple of lines set out. So for the first one, no, a computer's clock time is not a good source of entropy. And you can just really think about this in terms of bits, right? Like if you're looking at the clock time representation of time by computer system, so typically to give you like an idea, and this is in the solution, to represent a time within the scope of a day. So you know the day, the month, the year, and you're just concerned with like the hour and the seconds, maybe like the milliseconds, however granular you can get with time. But usually that's going to be encapsulated by like 17 bits of data. And then if you go towards like a month and then the year in which it was called, so a month is going to, like if you know it was called within the scope of a month, then there's like 22 bits worth of possibilities, right? So you can imagine it's like 2 to the 17, 2 to the 22, 2 to the 25. So 25 is with reference to if you know what year it was called, it's just 25 bits of entropy. So these amounts of bits of entropy, 17, 22, or 25, this is actually not bad at all. This is probably easier to break than your like computer password, where a single value in there has much more entropy. So the idea here is that a computer clock just consists of the number of seconds from a given point in time, right? So with a day, we have a starting point of time, and then the bits just represent the number of seconds that have started from a given point of time. So because of this, if you're able to figure out not a particular minute, but even if you can narrow down the pseudo-random value that was generated to the year it was generated, the month it was generated, or the day it was generated, the bits of entropy corresponding to the potential randomness of, okay, it was generated during this day, but not exactly at what time. That's 17 bits of entropy is really not that much to crack. So this is weak. So moving on, for point 2, the parent process ID, my process ID, and then time. So as we mentioned above, time is a weak source of entropy. The process ID and parent process ID, because these are determined by the processor and just based on different flushes, like if a computer is flushed, like these process IDs usually don't get to very, very high values. So again, these are like really weak sources of entropy. Like if you want to get an idea of what a process ID looks like, just open your command line and just type in the PS command, and that'll tell you what processes are running. So you can see from there that the entropy introduced by these values is not a lot, and they tend to be generated in a very sort of incremental sense. So if I made a process with an ID 1, the next one I make is going to be 2. So because of this, you're combining 3 sources of weak entropy, you're going to get something that's also weak. So the answer here is no, and I will box these guys to make it a little more obvious. So the next part of this should be a little bit faster. We know from here a hardware noise generator is a strong source of entropy, right? Now, we're thrown for a loop with this vector of zeros. So just recall that x XOR 0 is just going to give us x, right? That's one of the properties of XORs. So you can imagine here, if we're just doing an XOR with 0, this source of entropy is still going to be strong. Like, in a sense, XORing with the vector of zeros doesn't do anything to the original entropy, but if the original entropy was strong, then this is going to be a strong source of entropy. So the rest should be easy. We XOR a strong source of entropy with a weak source of entropy, and we get something that's still strong. So this is yes. Hardware noise generator, again, this is strong. So the tricky part here is now we're considering sort of like the third point from the guideline. So before we used a bunch of XORs, right? But now we're going to be using this AND operation. And what's notable about AND is that it actually tends to reduce the amount of entropy. So it's reductive of strong sources of entropy. So remember from here for this fifth point, if you have x, oh, that's the highlighter, x ANDed with 0, that's going to give you back 0. So no matter what your hardware noise generator spits out, because of the AND operation, this is going to be deterministically 0 every time. So this, of course, is a terrible source of key generation, because it's just going to give you a vector of 0, so it's no. And then recall here, we are taking a strong, so this is probably the trickiest one, strong, and then weak. But then if we're combining it with AND, again, this and so the specific property in general that makes it not a good way to combine entropy is that it's not injective. So because it's not injective, it would be removing entropy. And what this means is this would start to be skewed towards 0 as the output. So the injective definition is not something I'm going to go over explicitly just because it takes a bit. But you can just imagine, like, if you're looking at the AND logic table, 0, 0 gives you 0, 0, 1 gives you 0, 1, 0 gives you 0, and only in this case 1, 1 does it give you 1. So the problem here is if you had entropy, like if you had like a 50-50 split of randomness from before, and you apply AND a bunch of times, it's going to start to skew most of the original entropy towards 0, which is not good. And also with AND, there's only like 2 possible outputs from anything combined with an AND function, which is 0 or 1. So that's also reducing entropy. Okay, question number 2, PRNGs and stream ciphers. So PRNG stands for pseudo-random number generator. But this question is pretty fun in that we get this opportunity to construct our own symmetric key encryption scheme, which is pretty awesome. So suppose you have access to function R that takes a 120-bit seed S and integers n, n as input. R outputs the nth inclusive through mth inclusive exclusive bits produced by a pseudo-random generator when it is seeded with seed S. So as we can kind of see from here, the pseudo-random generator just kind of gives us some random value, and then you can kind of think of this as like some Python list splicing thing where it grabs the bits from n to m. So the goal here is we want to make a secure encryption scheme from above, secure symmetric key encryption scheme. So recall that with a symmetric key encryption, we're going to want to define how we generate the key, the encryption algorithm itself, and the decryption algorithm itself, right? So unlike asymmetric key encryption, with symmetric key, for both encryption and decryption, we're going to be using the same key. And the idea is that if you don't have these keys, then you shouldn't be able to figure out what the secret is, right? But if you do, then you should be able to decrypt and encrypt. Great. So definitely give this a bit of thought, but I will walk through the solution that the staff gives and explain it in the process. So for part A, for the key generation, this is kind of given to us, right? We already know that there is a pseudo-random generator. So all we have to do, well, the first thing that we want to plug in is the actual S value itself, right? So 128-bit seed, well, that seeded value should be random. So all we have to do for key generation is generate a random 128-bit value for the seed. And there's a variety of ways to do this, but simplest would just be finding a random function and using that. Great. So this 128-bit value, and I guess to keep the official text intact, that's kind of what it looks like. Great. So for part B, now that we have our key generation, we can actually use encryption, right? So the idea here is that with encryption, we have this PRNG value from above. And what we want to do is, let's just say, we want to encrypt a message like M, right? And M is of length L bits. Then the idea here is that for our encryption scheme, and remember for encryption, usually we take in the key we're encrypting by, and then the message itself, but then we can actually define the schema and extra variables relevant to it underneath the hood. What we can use, which is this R function, is we have R, we have the key that we wanted from before, which is like this value, so that's kind of our seed, right? But then we have to determine these two other parameters, which are N and M. So what we can do here is, after using the PRNG to generate a random value from the seed that we give it, we can actually extract the bits that we want to encode by specifying them as arguments here. So if it makes sense, like if we have a message of length L, and if we want to encode the message length M, which has bits indexed from 0 all the way to L, then all we have to do is generate a random number, so this is the PR, or generate a random value from K, and then grab the corresponding number of bits from this generated value, matching the length of the message that we're trying to encode. And as we mentioned from before, XOR is a perfect function to use here, as we have seen in a lot of symmetric key encryption algorithms. So yeah, just remember the properties that have been discussed in lecture and notes are why it's good for symmetric key encryption. Great. So once we encrypt, the main thing you might remember with encryption is we always don't want to ever repeat using values if possible. So generating a random value in the key generation should avoid that issue. But for example, the index that we use for J, we're going to want to change this to avoid anything deterministic. So after we encrypt, the J value, and as a consequence, J plus L will be different, but J should be incremented by L, and incrementing by L makes sure that even if somehow the same seed gets passed in, we aren't ever picking the same bits because we're picking the same positions. So if we have another message like M2 with length 2, then the next set of bits that we would be extracting from this generator would be like J plus L to J plus L plus L2, right? Great, so we have encryption. I guess this is big part A. So now we want decryption, right? So the idea here is that we want to use the same keys that we've defined above and the same properties about the message, and be able to recover the original message, right? So just recall the idea here is with decryption, what we have is we pass in the same key and the same ciphertext, and then we use the same pseudo-random number generator, and we know these values from above, so that's J and L, and then the key is really the secret that is being shared, and we do an XOR with C, right? So remember, C is really representative of, R, all this stuff XOR with. So this gives back C, and then this is just going to be R XOR M. So if we do an R XOR of R XOR M, then these two cancel out, and then this just gives back M. So that's an effective decryption. Great. So for part B, explain how a block cipher in counter mode is similar to the scenario that we just described above, right? So you might remember from part 1 with block ciphers, there's a lot of different schemas, right? So one of the modes that is out there is counter. So you might remember from the CBC diagram before that the way this encryption algorithm for the CBC schema works is that we're using the ciphertext generated by one encryption of one chunk of plain text as the key for the next encryption of plain text, right? Now, this is a pretty good practice, but as you can imagine, we can't generate the ciphertext for P1 until we've generated the ciphertext for P0, right? So the runtime for CBC would be linear in that sense. So you would have to get C0 before initiating C1, right? Now, if you might remember from, if you haven't, but just as like a quick rehash, the way counter mode works is that, first of all, instead of having an initialization vector, instead we have a nonce. And we also have a counter. So the nonce is still a random value, like random hex code here. And then counter, you can literally think of as like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So what we do here is, this is the representation of the two combined. Our block cipher is actually the first thing that we pass this value into. We pass in the key, and then we XOR whatever we get here with the plain text to get our ciphertext. Now you notice here, if I do another one for so our nonce is still going to be the same as before, but now it's like counter +1. So we're still, using the block cipher. We still have a corresponding key. But if we pass in P1, then we get C1. So what you'll notice here, as opposed to CBC, is that there's no dependence or reliance of the ciphertext generation for C1 on C0, unlike before. So remember, the distinguishing point between block ciphers and stream ciphers are that stream ciphers encrypt like digits or letters or whatever of your message like one character at a time, right? But a block cipher will take like a bundle of bits and then encrypt them all together. And then there's some padding to make sure the encrypted message is a multiple of the fixed length encryption, right? So the reason that this is more similar to a stream cipher is that it uses the key to generate, a pseudo-random stream of bits, similar to, what we had from here. And then the random stream is XORed with the message, so P0, that chunk, to form the ciphertext. So there's no dependency. Which means that this is much more efficient, it computes a lot faster, but this lack of dependency is really what makes it similar. And as we mentioned, IV is replaced with nonce and counter. Great. So the nonce and counter are encrypted with the key K to produce the random stream that for a given element of the plaintext P is XORed with P to produce the ciphertext C. So that's just kind of reading from the solution, but the idea is that counter is defined as, and I'll just write this from the solutions just so you have it, nonce, and then remember the double bar is like concatenation, so we're just concatenating the nonce and the counter here. It's important that the nonce doesn't get revealed, otherwise the counter is just iteration, so you can figure that out pretty easily. The ciphertext is just going to be the plain text itself XORed with this random value generated from the generator, and then the plain text can be recovered by taking the ciphertext and XORing it with the original random value, right? So similar to what we had above, the ciphertext here comes from the plain text XORed with the pseudo-random value, which is exactly what we have here. And then the decryption of XORing the ciphertext with the pseudo-random value to give us the original message. That's exactly what we see here. All right, the very last section, question 3, block cipher security. So we can get a much better diagram of CBC here. Maybe I should have referred to this one, but as a reminder, the cipher block chaining schema CBC mode of operation works like this, right? So as a reminder, we have the plain text from here, we have the initialization vector, we XOR it, pass it into the block cipher, and then that output is going to be used as the sort of next quote-unquote initialization vector, but it's really just the ciphertext from P0 as the thing to be XORed with the next plain text, right? So recall just from like previously, there is a dependence of the output of C1 on the creation of C0, which is why this is linear. So this needs to be completed, then this one, and then this one can be completed. And then hopefully you are able to sort of prove to yourself why this decryption works. But the idea here is kind of like if I have C1, I get, let's just say like this was P0 and then this is C1. So, and I'm going to call whatever is here, I'm going to call it like temp1, right? So when the block cipher comes back, you get a temp1 right here. And remember, actually I take that back. Temp1 is not this value. Temp1 is in fact this value, because what it was originally was just C1, right? So remember, P0 XOR with the IV was T1. So then if C1 gets converted back to T1 over here, then T1 XORed with the IV, which is just T1 XORed, substitution. I'm not doing that right. I guess maybe I should call this T0. Sorry, I'm mixing up a lot of things. Okay, P0 XOR IV XOR IV. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. All I did was a substitution, and that just gives us back P0, right? So that's why the decryption works. Cool. So now we're going to test and turn some of these knobs and see if this thing still works properly. So the output of the encryption is a ciphertext concatenated with the initialization vector that was used. Good to know. So in part A, what happens if two messages are encrypted with the same key and knots? What can the attacker learn about the two messages just by looking at the ciphertext? Right, so this is a pretty interesting case study. Now, to put this practically, I have a bit of a prepared example. Let's imagine that your first set of you have the identical key and identical nonce. So I guess nonce in this case, just for clarification, refers to the initialization vector. So I will sort of denote that here. So this is just the IV, right? So you can kind of imagine, let's just say that the first message that we encrypt, so message 1 is, let's just say like, oh man, I'm very indecisive when it comes to writing. Good day, sir. And then our message 2, sir, and let's just add some text here. Sir, what's a good name? Sir Bob. And then these are not very elegant names. Good day, ma'am. And to illustrate the point a little later on, let's just also call it Bob. Again, these are not good messages, but assume that, let's just say that like the fixed encryption size is 4 characters and we're padding any ones like with fewer than 4 characters to be the same to be up to 4 characters, right? So if it's day, it's going to just get this empty space of a character here. So these are, I'm just sort of highlighting what the plain texts are that are going to be encrypted piece by piece by CBC. So not the best thing, but let's just assume that it works that way, right? So the first time this message gets encrypted, let's just say it's like P0, it's like the same IV. I'll call this like P00, the first 0 to indicate that it's, okay, I'll call it P10 to indicate that it's the first message and the 0th plain text of the first message, right? So we XOR the two together, we pass it into the cipher block with the same key, and we get predictably what we call C10, right? And then we pass that in to P20, XOR CB, and then of course the key, I'm just not going to put that in, and let's just call this like, this is still the first message, C11, right? And then this ciphertext gets used, so I'm going to just fill this out really, really quickly. P3, should be P11, P12, XOR CB, C12, right? So on and so forth. So we can do a similar thing for P20, right? So this would just be, good day, man, Bob. So we pass that in, again, same IV, same key. Now, let's just take a look at this very first instance here. What happens? Well, we know P10 has this value of like good, right? And we know, let's just say we potentially don't even know what the value of P20 is. But we do know that the IV, the nonce, and the key are being reused. So XOR is a deterministic value. So P20 and IV, if it's the same as P10, is going to give us the very same value before it enters the cipher block. And then the cipher block itself is also a one-to-one function, as we mentioned from before. So we have C20 here, but what happens, we took the same value, identical values, P1 and P20, and we passed them through the same set of encryption, so XOR and then the cipher block operation, both of which are deterministic with the same inputs. So what does that lead us to think? Well, C20 is going to be equal to C10. So hopefully that makes sense, right? So the problem with this is that if we reuse the IV and the key, or the nonce and the key in this case, the attacker will be able to determine another message's values up to the point where the message starts differentiating. So the reason I illustrated the two cipher blocks is to make this point, right? So let's just keep drawing, even though this is a bit repetitive. CB, pass it in. So again, the cipher that we're passing in at this point, because the two ciphertexts are the same, as we just demonstrated for the first message and the second message, since they're both, good, the word good, then what's coming in here is the same. Now, P11, P11, and P21, so P11 is day, P21 is also day, these values are the same. So again, because P21 and P11 are the same, the ciphertext entering is the same, the cipher block hashes one-to-one in the same way, this C21 is going to also be equal to C11, which is not good. Now, this is the part where things would start to detract, right? So we still have the same ciphertext coming in for, at this point for both messages, but what happens is now P2 is a bit different, which means that the outputted ciphertext, because P12, which is sir, and P22, which is ma'am, are different, then these ciphertexts won't be the same. Which means that even, we can repeat this operation for the fourth word in each of these messages. And even though they are both Bob, so they both have the same value. Now in this case, even though P23, p23 and p13. So again, referencing these are both the value of Bob. Even though these are the same, now the ciphertext C2, oh, I guess this should be C22. C22 and C12, these two are different. So that means that even though the input message is the same, since the nonce that's being used for XOR is different, then the resulting C23 is going to be different. So this is what we mean when we say if the IV is reused and if the key is reused, the attacker can determine if two messages have the same value up to where it starts being different. So the elegant way to put this in the solution is if two messages have identical prefixes up to but not including the first block containing the difference, right? So even if we have a whole segment of text where there's one differentiating word, like in this case it would be, sir versus ma'am, because this affects the ciphertext of the subsequent characters, then even if there are similar messages after the first differentiating point, the attacker would not be able to determine that those values are identical, right? So the idea here is we want to use IVs that are unique. We don't want to use them again, even if we encrypt the same message multiple times, because the problem is if we reuse the same IV, it'll generate a ciphertext that is deterministic. But if we don't, the values that are being spit out will look distinct and they will be random looking. So that is a slightly verbose but hopefully clear summary of part A. Moving on to part B. If the random number generator used for IV creation is sabotaged, an attacker may be able to predict IVs used to encrypt future data. So kind of the difference here is that before, it was encrypted with the same key and nonce, but now we're just saying like the IV creation is sabotaged. So the IV used for encrypting one message to another, they could be different, but the attacker knows the value or can predict the IVs used to encrypt future data, right? So if this is the case, can an attacker win the indistinguishability under chosen plaintext attack game against, so AES CBC, remember the way we read this is AES refers to the block cipher that's being used and CBC refers to the schema that's being used. So we're talking about the cipher block chaining schema, which uses the AES encryption algorithm as the block cipher encryption, so sort of the CB block there, right, against this mode of operation. So specifically, an attacker provides one block long plain text messages P1 and P2 to an oracle, which encrypts one of the plain text using IV. So this is just like we're just reiterating how IND-CPA works. Can an attacker determine the plaintext used for the first encryption by requesting encryptions of a few chosen plaintexts? So this is pretty interesting. And again, the attacker knows the IV for N. Great. So again, let's kind of think about this, right? Like, let's draw the CBC diagram without filling anything in. So we have our plaintext, and let's just say like this is like IV1, right? And this goes through some AES block cipher. We don't know the key in this case, so I'm going to just put a question mark next to things we don't know. And then this is going to give us the ciphertext, right? So what happens when we pass in a message for the first time, right? Let's just say that we pass in like a message 1, right? So the ciphertext that we're going to be encrypting is, so at this point, it's going to be like M1 XORed with IV1, right? And then when we run decryption, we would get M1, right? Now, during the first game, there's not much that we can tell. But if we play this game again with IV2, and again, these values are known to the attacker. So I guess to make it clear a little bit, like I'm just going to draw this as an abstraction bound, we're going to do decryption here. Above was encryption. And let's just say, so the way decryption works, again, is we pass it through AES, feeding in the key. And again, we don't know this key, but we know that whatever gets outputted here should be M1 XOR IV1, right? And then we XOR these guys, IV1, that's a really big XOR, and we get back M1, right? So that's kind of the idea. Now, what we can do is we can be really smart here as the attacker. So since I know IV2, again, I don't know the key, and a lot of this intermediate stuff doesn't matter too much. So when we XOR the two together, we'll get some message, right? So the trick here is, can you think of a message to plug in here where the output would correspond to the block cipher output for the previous value, right? So when we talk about the previous block cipher, we're referring to this guy here. So if we plug in a value here, that will give us back M1 IV1. Why is this bad? Well, the same key and AES are being used, which means if we can somehow make this happen, then this causes C1 to be equal to C2, which is not good, right? So the idea here is that, like, if I know C2 is just equal to C1, similar to before, I can just use previous states and information I gained from a previous game and use it to my advantage in the next game, right? So this is kind of similar to before. And the answer to what we fill out here, hopefully, by seeing, one of the factors in the output, you can just kind of see all we have to plug in is this. Because by XORing this value with IV2, we're essentially canceling the two IV2s out, ensuring that the value being passed into the block ciphers are the same. So the problem with this is we can now use the plain text from the first encryption by requesting encryptions of a few chosen plain text. So this was mentioned in the text right here. And because of this, we can effectively distinguish between what value we passed in, right? So the idea here with the IND-CPA game is that, we can pass in like message A, which is M1, IV1, IV2. And then message B doesn't really matter, whatever is in there. But we just know that the ciphertext that we're given back is going to be, the AES block cipher of M1, IV1, which we had from game one. Game one. Right, so all we have to do, again, similar to before, is we just compare the cipher with what was from game one. So again, C1 is equal to AES M1 IV1. So if we find that the ciphertext from game 2 is equal to the ciphertext from game 1, we know that we passed in message A. Otherwise, if it's not, we know we passed in message B. So that's how we win this game. So again, a reminder, IVs not being reused and being very unpredictable. So again, we saw the problem with what if we reuse the IV from part A. And we saw the problem with what if we know the IV from part B. So it's really, really important that IVs are randomly generated, very unpredictable, and they are not repeated across messages. If we satisfy both criteria, we can generate something really random, and that's pretty indistinguishable.